Morning. Thank you for joining us today. We'll give everybody about a minute or so just to get settled. Hopefully you have your coffee this morning and you're ready for some great information. So we will give you just about a minute and then we'll get started. All right, guys. Well, welcome. We are super thrilled to have you here today for our first support seminar. You're going to get a lot of great information. And I'm actually, before we get too into the weeds, I am Brittany Glenn. I am the new schools manager. I'm joined by some really great people here on the call, and I will actually let you guys introduce yourself, and then we'll get started with the wonderful information that we have set for you today. John, if you want to go ahead. Actually, Christy, if you want to go ahead.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Christy Sadri. I'm the Director of Charter School Authorizing. And so happy to have you all here today. John, I'll pass it to you.
Everybody, good morning. Good morning. I see some familiar names, so thanks for joining. John Garland, again, been doing this same role since around Gen 2021. So I'm excited for Gen 30 and looking forward to the presentations today and all your questions. And Sarah, I will go ahead and kick it over to you.
Good morning, y'all. My name is Sarah Kahn. I'm a new school specialist, and I'm really excited to be here to support you on your journey for Generation 30.
And I am Jeff Cook. I'm a portfolio coordinator with the division, and you'll be hearing from me in a few minutes. John.
Awesome. Thanks, guys. So, John, if you want to kind of go over some updates, norms, and some questions, and we'll have Sarah kind of ground our conversation. And then, Jeff, we will hear all the wonderful things that you have to talk to us about governance.
All right. Thank you, Brittany. Can everyone see the agenda? Give me a thumbs up. Excellent. Okay. So you all already know why you're here, but I'm going to go ahead and outline it. You all registered. So this is our first support seminar. Today we'll be talking about governance, community engagement. We're also going to be talking about the Charter School Startup Grant. And then David Marks will join us as the last presenter, and he will talk about some best practices for the financial plan workbook and the finance plan. All right. So let's do some updates, norms, and kind of get to maybe some questions up front. So some updates. We've had some emails about the recordings and presentations for the application information sessions that you all attended. We are working on getting those recordings and presentations loaded up. They should be online and able to download and access by the end of the week. We will send out an email most likely on Friday, just as a general updates email for folks. With any other relevant information. In that, we should be able to tell you that those recordings and presentations are up. That said, as we move forward with these support seminars, we also record these, and we will make the presentations that we discussed today available to you as well. Those will most likely not be available by Friday, but hopefully early next week. In terms of the FAQ document, again, we've got some emails about the FAQ document. Because we have to update that every year and comb through the 50-page FAQ document that we currently have to make sure that we're giving you the most updated information. It takes a little bit of time. So again, we should hopefully get that to you all by next week, maybe middle of next week, for you all to review that as well. In terms of technical support questions, so A+ for those who reached out already with those technical support questions, whether it's you haven't been able to access the narrative document or the financial plan workbook. You all need to be really on top of that. So if you all have not been able to open the narrative document, or you have not tried to open the workbook yet, or all the attachments, you need to do that because time is of the essence. That's something that we will continue to support you on throughout the process, but you really do want to give yourself a lot of runway to get those issues addressed before it's too late, because some of those attachments do take quite a while to complete. In terms of office hours, just want to remind everyone that our first office hours are on October 16th, 9 a.m. And again, you don't have to join those, but please feel free to join us with questions and be prepared to talk with and engage with other applicants as well. Norms. Just like the application information session, please use the Q&A function, not the chat function of our webinar today. And then I personally just recommend that you all have a copy of that narrative document and the financial plan workbook available. Again, just as reference, should you need to ask questions about it or follow along with Jeff or Nathaniel or David. Okay, last but not least, logistical and or technical questions that we can answer now. So if you have any like timeline questions, again, logistical questions, anything that's not really related per se to the presentations today, let's just go ahead and get those out of the way now. Feel free to answer them or ask them later, but giving you all the opportunity. Okay, let's see. Great question. Someone's asking, do you need to request a document to evidence your attendance? So the answer is no, you do not. Again, Zoom will automatically capture your attendance. And so that is not something you will need to request or provide in the application. When you submit it, we are able to refer to our own report to verify. The only thing that I would add, that if anyone did join by phone, please email us the phone number to which you joined with. I think that may be 1 or 2 people, but by and by, we are able to capture all you all's attendance. Are there any other logistical, technical questions that we can get to?
As of right now, John, you have nothing else.
Nothing. Okay, so again, as you all see the presentations, if something else pops in your head, feel free to put it in the Q&A and we will get to it, or our presenters will. So with that said, Sarah, if you want to go ahead and ground us in our next presentation, let me get that slide pulled.
John, thank you all for joining us today. Before we begin our session on governance, we just want to remind you all that within your instruction and guidance document, you're going to find the evaluation criteria for each of those questions that you're asked in your narrative document. And so we highly recommend that you're going back to it as a way to ground yourself and to really make sure that you're filling out your application in its fullest. So we want to talk about some of the formation and structure criteria that we have in order to get a strong response. It's listed on that right here. We're going to go ahead and talk through those. So present a skill set that demonstrates a strong capacity to meet the needs of running a successful charter school and launch A and B. So while Jeff is talking, he's going to talk through how we can build a strong governance formation in order to make sure that you have that strong capacity. Then you're also going to want to describe specific roles and responsibilities of your sponsoring entity, any partner organizations that you might have, so that it's very clear within that structure. So with that, I'll go ahead and pass it over to Jeff.
Can everyone see my presentation? Good. Anyway, good morning again, everybody. My name is Jeff Cook. I'm a portfolio coordinator on the portfolio management team in the Division of Charter School Authorizing. That means I'm one of the folks that helps answer general questions and facilitate charter amendments and renewals for charter school operators across Texas. My team has the responsibility to support schools once they have launched. Today, I'm going to speak about building an effective governing board. I can tell you, I get to be on an awesome team, and the work that we do together is so much better than if we were just individuals doing our own thing, working separately. just happening to be in the same place. So after talking with board members at different schools over the years I've visited, I have this presentation about what makes a good board to help you build a great team for your school. In this presentation today, I'll be addressing the agenda items here: board member selection generally, advantages of a diverse board, integrity of board members, and board member duties and training requirements. Then there should be time for questions at the end. And also, like they said earlier, this presentation will be made available to you. Instrumental in having a great board is the groundwork that you'll lay as you select members and build the board. In this section, I'll describe the type of board member that is likely to be successful in governing a quality charter school. Board members are charged with promotion and evaluation of the school's mission and vision. First, by helping to establish the mission and vision of the school in the first place, and then revisiting that mission and revising it as needed. So sometimes the original mission and vision of the school has to evolve to respond to meet the needs of the community. For instance, the board of a school that was founded with a curriculum based in the classics may determine that a curriculum focused on science and math may better serve the community, or vice versa. Good board members must also make sure that the school's curriculum, programs, and activities are aligned with Texas law and the Texas Essential Knowledge and Skills, or TEKS, and that these things are consistent with that mission and vision of the school. And then, promoting the mission and vision of the school also means communicating these items clearly to students, staff, parents, and the community. The charter board does not sit in a vacuum and make decisions without public involvement. Good board members also need to be inquisitive about the school's student achievement, transparent about the information that they're basing their decisions on, and explaining how they arrived at their decisions. The way that board members influence the performance of a charter school is by doing the following: setting concrete goals for academic, financial, and operational performance, hiring a school leader that will implement those goals. That is, the charter school board members will understand what areas of the school are most in need. For example, maybe the school has a need for improvement in the area of academics. And to that end, the board searches for and hires a school leader that has particular expertise, in this case, in evaluating student assessment data and influencing how curriculum is delivered to improve student achievement. So, to achieve the goals set by the board, a good board member will provide resources to help in completion of these goals. And this could be advice based on that board member's area of expertise or resources from their own profession. And it could be help with fundraising to meet the school's goals, or using his or her professional network to put the school in touch with people that can help. And good board members don't stop with just setting goals. They establish progress measures that'll be revisited periodically to determine whether these goals are being met. These can be ongoing checkpoints throughout the year, or they can be summative assessments that happen at the end of the year, ideally both. The Texas Administrative Code, or TAC, rules regard these as primary responsibilities of the board. I'd like to focus on the board member's responsibility to hire a good school leader to implement the school's mission and vision, and the member's responsibility to hold that school leader accountable. This is, it's called a non-delegable duty under 19 TAC section 100.1113, which I will touch upon again later in this presentation. Good board members are expected to do this by providing resources to help the operation of the school. This could be the board member's expertise. This could be help with fundraising. Allowing the leader to manage these resources to accomplish the goals of the school. Sometimes the appropriate thing for a board member to do is provide room for the superintendent to do his or her job, but also holding that superintendent accountable to the mission and vision as measured by the performance goals that are set by the board. The best practice is for the board to adopt an instrument for evaluating the superintendent's performance and using it at specified times throughout the year. Also, to do their job, board members must be transparent in their operation and willing to listen to the concerns of students, parents, staff, and the charter community. The Texas Open Meetings Act, which is also known as TOMA, is intended to ensure this very thing, prescribing rules for all boards that boards must follow so that they will be accountable to the public. In addition to meeting in the open, board members can act on the board proactively by establishing issue-specific committees with access to high-quality, reliable information to advise the rest of the board, and also seek feedback from the public through other processes, like surveys and other open forums. To summarize, here are some suggested questions that it would be helpful for your board to discuss. What are the ways that I, as a board member, promote the mission and vision of the school? And how do we do this as a board? As a board, have we set performance expectations for the school? Do we know what those metrics are? Are they measurable? How often do we review progress on performance expectations? Is the superintendent's evaluation linked to our performance expectations? What other performance measures are in place for our superintendent? And as a board, do we have systems in place to get feedback from key stakeholders, including parents, staff, community members, and students? In the previous slides, I have described in general what a board member's role is. And in this section, I'll focus a little more on what makes a good board member. In other words, what good board members should bring to the table. So there are advantages to having a diverse board. When I talk about diversity here, I'm talking about professional diversity. Individual board members should have personal and professional experiences and training that provide a variety of skills on the ground for the school that will benefit the school, including areas such as finance, education, real estate, law, or any number of professions that can enhance the operation of a school. I used to teach at a school that needed a new playground, for instance. One of the board members happened to be a playground architect and could provide a service to the school by touring the available space and helping to determine what renovations were possible and what the students could benefit from. Other needed traits of board members include an ability to communicate effectively to staff, parents, and students, a willingness to grow professionally and be knowledgeable about assessments, finances, and operations of a school. And along with that, the ability to look critically at what they can do for the school and to hold themselves accountable for the overall success of the school and the accomplishment of its mission and vision. Charter school boards should discuss whether their membership reflects professional diversity and should ask themselves, what are some areas of professional expertise that we need to add to our board? And I have spoken some about who board members should be. Now, in these last two sections this morning, I'd like to talk about what board members should do. Members have fiduciary duties toward their schools. They are entrusted with the responsibility of ensuring the school is well managed, has high academic expectations and performance, and is fiscally sound. In particular, these duties fall into three categories: duty of care, duty of loyalty, and duty of obedience. And I'll talk about each one in turn. First, the duty of care. The duty of care requires that board members be reasonably aware of what is happening at the school so that they can make informed decisions. They should be prepared for meetings, and at those meetings, actively participate in planning and decision-making and welcome input from the public and fellow board members. And they should make informed judgments based upon the information that is available. And as I mentioned before, it will be apparent when good board members are exercising their duty of care because their reasoning is transparent and they communicate their decisions well. Next, the duty of loyalty. Board members always put the best interests of the school above any personal or professional interests. They should not serve on the board for financial or other gain. Fulfilling this duty requires board members to be free of actual conflicts of interest and also to be free of perceived conflicts of interest. The best practice for board members is to avoid a perception of a conflict because boards function best when the community has confidence that the board is a good steward of taxpayer money that is intended to educate their children. And finally, the duty of obedience. This includes compliance with the law, but that's not all. It also requires board members to ensure the school is acting in good faith to fulfill the terms of its charter contract and policies established by the authorizer, in other words, the TEA. And when making decisions, board members should only act in the best interest of students. The board should also ensure that the school is obeying the policies that the board itself has adopted. Last, I will describe the duties of board members and also board training requirements. Texas law outlines the basic duties of a charter board. Some aspects of running a school can be delegated to the superintendent or other individuals, but there are certain non-delegable duties that the board shall not give away. These are specified in rule in 19 TAC 1113A1. The board has final authority to hear or decide employee grievances, citizen complaints, or parental concerns, adopt or amend the budget of the charter school, or to authorize the expenditure or obligation of state funds or the use of public property, direct the disposition or safekeeping of public records, and wherever those records are being kept, the governing body has the superior right of immediate access to, control over, and possession of such records. The board has final authority to adopt policies governing charter school operations, approve annual audit reports, and hire, direct, compensate, evaluate, and, if necessary, terminate the employment of the chief executive officer or superintendent. Superintendents have their own non-delegable duties. They have the final authority to organize the charter school's central administration, approve reports or data submissions required by law, and to select and terminate charter school employees or officers. It's important to ensure that there is a clear reporting relationship between the superintendent and the board. A new set of charter school rules became effective on October 2nd, 2024, and governance training rules were revised as part of that. The basic content of the training is similar to what it's been in the past, but the way the training is structured in the rules now is different, and these new rules will require new curriculum documents and training modules, which are going to be coming online in the coming months. The new rules are organized from general rule requirements for training and then narrowing to the requirements for specific roles to be trained for folks new in their roles, and also continuing training requirements thereafter. The general training requirements for all roles, board member and officer, are the training must be delivered by an authorized training provider. That's someone who has demonstrated that they have knowledge of the subject to be taught. Those seeking to be providers will apply to the TEA, and all trainers must be approved by TEA before their training will count toward the requirements that we're talking about here. The delivery of the training can be in person or it can be online, but what trainings all must have is real-time interaction with the instructor, and the training must assess the learning of the training recipient and provide feedback. There are exemptions for individuals that are already certified by other bodies or get training from other bodies. For instance, board members that are on governmental entities, boards, or college or university boards, and that are already subject to training as being members of those bodies. Or, for instance, an individual is a superintendent that has already had his or her standard superintendent certificate bestowed on them. Then we get to the core training that all board members and officers must get, and that's 10 instructional hours. And the breakdown of those hours is dedicated to each core topic and will be specified in a curriculum that the commissioner will issue. But the core topics that everyone must be trained in include charter law, accountability to the public, evaluating and improving student outcomes, which sometimes is abbreviated ISO, E-I-S-O, accountability for public funds, and school safety. These are the core training requirements. And then there are additional training requirements that are role specific to new board members and new officers. Board members must get 2 additional hours on top of the core hours, touching on the topics discussed throughout my presentation today, like hiring and evaluating a superintendent, non-delegable duties, or best practices in governance. And administrative officers, central administrative officers must get 20 additional training hours on top of the core topics. Business managers must get 20 additional hours expanding on those core topics. Continuing training requirements for board members and officers, that is, in subsequent years after the individual has completed the core training and the additional training, will include topics that will meet the needs of the school, address updates to the core training, or specialized training for schools that underperformed in academic or financial accountability measures. Continuing training hours are: board members are required to get 6 hours per year, central administrative officers get 15 hours per year, and campus administrative officers will get 5 hours continuing training per year. Business managers' continuing training is 15 hours per year. One last new rule that I want to make sure and point out is that for both additional training and continuing training, if excess hours are earned beyond what's required, 25% of the hours in excess of the requirements may be carried over to meet the next year's requirements. So I want to thank you very much for listening to these tips for building an effective board. I have some time remaining for taking questions. And if you'll put them in the Q&A, I'll answer as many as I can. And any answers that I don't know, I'll be happy to look into and get back to you.
Hey, Jeff, we don't have any questions for you yet. While we wait for folks to put in their questions, I did want to kind of thank you for that presentation. I'm also going to take it and kind of wrap it in a nice bow and apply it to the application, right? So great information. I want our applicants to understand, like, ground this and where you are, right? So you are starting a founding board, right? You're not a mature board yet. Some of you may be, right, depending on if you're an experienced operator, high performing entity, et cetera. But most of you are going to be coming into this process brand new, and you're going to be starting a founding board. And what's important And how you apply what Jeff is talking about is understanding that all this culminates into you finding folks that are willing to put in the work, right? That's the most important part of this process right now is as you find board members, you need to make sure that they are going to be able to invest the time it's going to take to not only show up to meetings, but also go to events, also help you with the application, whether it's reading it, editing it, etc., attending the interview, attending all of the things that happen after you get a charter, but before you actually start serving students. So it's a huge time commitment. But all of that groundwork is laid right now. All right. So that gets me to my second point is just prospecting for potential board members if you don't already have them, and then really developing a process. We've talked to many superintendents throughout this process, and a lot of them, if not most of them, have said, one thing that really helped them during this part of the process and finding board members was really trying to develop a system, whether that's keeping an Excel spreadsheet of folks you've reached out to, but maybe haven't spoken to, like just having a system that maybe you can follow up with people. Also making sure that as you look for your board members, that you are being realistic again with the time commitment that they're going to have. So if you think that maybe putting a whole bunch of big names on your board is going to help, that may help. But again, those big names need to really be able to have the time to invest during this process. And then, so it just trickles down. So as you look for your board members and are prospecting for those, again, look in your personal network, LinkedIn, just have a diverse sort of mechanism to which you can pull and prospect for those board members. That's extremely important as to, again, account for what Jeff was talking about, which is that professional diversity. And then the third thing, tying it back to the app info session and best practices, during that app info session, we highly recommended that you all go back and look at all those capacity interviews because we archived them. Those are available for you to watch. You will see that there is a large expectation not only for the proposed superintendent, but also board members, right? And so as you interact with board members, as they help you through this process, again, you need to be sure that they understand that they are going to be interacting with, TEA, with potentially SBOE, not to scare them off, but just so they understand the totality. Because what we don't want, right, is that you all put this amazing board on paper and then down the line, maybe you have turnover, right? Because then you have to pivot. So we just want to be sure that you understand that this is a founding board. They need to be able to put the work in, have a diverse way of finding those folks, and then just ensuring that those folks really understand the scope of kind of commitment that they're signing up for. So I just want to throw those out there, tying it back to kind of the application and where you all are.
There is
Jeff,
a question
go
in the chat. Yeah, go ahead, John.
Yeah, Jeff, someone's asking, do board members start training before June or do they wait after? Do you happen to know a response for that one right now? Pending authorization.
I would say board members can start a little early, but really the training year starts when the board member begins service on that board. And so if I'm a board member and I start August 1 in a given year, my training year is from that day to August 1 the following year. So you just need to make sure and get all the training that you need done in that space of time.
So Jeff, let me rephrase the question. I'm just wondering, maybe
Cool.
this person is trying to get to. If you don't have if it's still pending authorization, so they haven't received a charter yet, right? So they're still in the summer, they haven't received a charter yet. Can they start those trainings then, or do they have to have a school first? Does that make sense?
Yes. I think that I'll have to get back to folks on that, or it'll be in the FAQ as far as what the rules are for when the training is applicable to the requirements.
Jeff, I don't see any other questions. We'll give folks a couple more seconds to input any of your questions.
While folks are doing that, it's okay if I toss up my
Yes,
contact information.
perfect.
Sure.
Thank you.
Yeah, so if you're like me and you walk away from a meeting and then think of a question that you wish you'd asked, you can follow up with me, and I'll get back to you as soon as I can.
Thank you so much for joining us, Jeff. And
You're
John,
welcome.
if you don't see anything, I don't see anything either. I think we're good. Thank you, Jeff. We really
You're
appreciate
welcome.
it. All right, so we're going to go back and ground ourselves in the criteria for CSP, and then we'll have Nate give us some information.
Alrighty, I think, oh, give us 1 second, Nate. We're gonna go back to the CSP criteria and then we'll come back to you. So sorry about that. So while you're looking at this, I'm actually not going to read all of these out to you. Instead, I'm gonna give you just a moment to read through these CSP criteria and then I'll talk a little bit more about them. So I'm gonna give you a couple seconds just to read through. All right, and before we dive into the details a little bit, I'll just name again, these criteria are not hidden from you all. They are in the instruction and guidance document. We highly encourage you to check those out. But before we talk with Nate, I want to frame this discussion around what makes for a strong responses, especially answering these narrative response questions in regards to the CSP grant. The evaluation criteria are centered around having a really detailed startup plan, which is clearly defining those tasks and responsibilities for those individuals in charge of those. This will ensure that your budget is crafted effectively to help support those CSP goals, ensure adequate staffing, and really secure the necessary resources and being able to utilize the funds to your best benefits. You'll also want to focus on planning for financial sustainability beyond the grant, monitoring your progresses and setting up those SMART goals. And these criteria really will guide your narrative responses to make sure that you're prepared for a successful launch. So it's really important that before you're getting started with answering these questions, you're really grounding yourself in what are we looking for? How is this going to make sure that you have that sustainability long term? So with that, I'll go ahead and pass it over to Nate.
There. Are y'all able to see the presentation now? Awesome. Well, good morning, everybody. Hope you're all having a great day so far. Going to take some time to discuss the CSP Startup Grant. My name is Nate Johnson, and I am the TEA Charter Schools Program Grant Manager. Here's my email. If at any point you have any questions that you may come to you after this session ends today, feel free to reach out at any time, as I will be your point of contact for anything and everything CSP related. I've also listed the names of Charlotte Werman and Carmen Patrick, as they are both heavily involved in helping me facilitate the CSP grant and will be in communication with you at different stages of the process. So here's our agenda for today. We'll discuss the purpose, the grant timelines, some of the allowable uses of funds, as well as goal setting. We'll go into some of the specific questions that are embedded within your Gen 30 application pertaining to CSP. After we cover all these items, we'll have time for a Q&A session. So feel free to drop any questions you have in the chat as I move through the presentation, and I will address them at the end. So the purpose of the Charter Schools Program Grant, this was a $100 million grant we received in the fall of 2020 from the U.S. Department of Education. The grant period began on October 1st of 2020 and will run through September 30th of 2025. We at TEA award subgrants to you as subgrantees up to $900,000 for you to open and prepare new charter schools. That is the case for y'all, and also to replicate and expand existing high-quality charter schools. So these grants to open and prepare new charter schools are non-competitive grants. Should you receive a Generation 30 charter and you're approved and not vetoed by SBOE, you will be listed as one of the eligible applicants for the non-competitive Generation 30 CSP grant. So the purpose of this grant is to support the growth of high-quality charter schools in Texas, especially those focused on improving academic outcomes for educationally disadvantaged students. So as far as the grant timeline, the grant start date is the date which you as an LEA can start incurring costs related to the grant. Next, we have our NOGA date, which is the date that your NOGA is approved and the LEA can start entering expenditures for reimbursement. So let's say Campus A spent 2 months in negotiation and get their NOGA 2 months after the grant start date. That means you'll be able to request reimbursement for any expense you incurred from that grant start date to the NOGA date. However, any expenses that are unallowable per the CSP program guidelines or are not aligned to your approved application will not be eligible for reimbursement. So if you are going to start incurring expenses between the grant start date and the NOGA start date or the NOGA date, please ensure that you are adhering to your proposed budget and that the expenses that you're going to incur costs for are allowable for reimbursement under the grant. Just want to take some time to go over some grant management basics. So the grant start date will depend on when the funding memo is released to the public. All of your expenditures and services must take place within the grant period. So that is on or after the grant start date and before or on the grant end date. So if you are making an expense that's allowable for reimbursement is in your budget the day before the grant start date, we will not be able to reimburse you for that. So please make sure anything you're planning to purchase and request reimbursement for through CSP occurs on or between the grant start date and end date. I'm sorry about that. Subgrantees will have access to their NOGA and be able to request reimbursement after the negotiations are complete. Carmen Patrick is our grant negotiator. So what you have in your original application, sometimes something will need to be changed. That's why we ask you to be cautious when you're requesting reimbursement for costs incurred between the grant start date and NOGA date. Your reimbursement requests are going to be entered through TEA's expenditure reporting system and require proper source documentation for approval. So you will submit that request to expenditure reporting. I will get a notification from our expenditure reporting team letting me know that you have submitted that request. I will then touch base with you and ask for detailed source documentation so I can verify that the purchases took place within the grant period, are all allowable. Once everything's good to go on my end, I will give my approval to expenditure reporting to release payment back to you. Finally, amendment requests must be submitted and approved before the proposed activity or budget change takes place. We've had in the past some grantees who decided that they were going to spend money elsewhere before and did so before submitting a grant amendment request. And when that request was denied because what they were proposing was not allowable, they were then responsible for the costs incurred. So please wait for amendment request approval before you start taking on those changed activities or budget items. So the CSP grant is broken down into 2 different phases, planning and implementation. Activities related to the planning and program design of the Charter's educational program is the first phase. So those activities can take place from the grant start period, grant start date to the first day the campus begins serving students. And this planning activities cannot occur for more than 18 months. Then there is the implementation phase where you can conduct activities related to the implementation of your Charter's educational program. And these activities usually occur between the first day the campus begins serving students and the grant end date. So this little timeline down here just visualizes what I had discussed. This is the grant start date. Up to the first day of school is the planning phase. Again, this cannot be longer than 18 months. And then from the first day of school to the grant end date is considered the implementation phase. So budgeted expenditures are tied to the type of activity, not necessarily when the expenditure occurs. So planning activities, again, are activities or expenditures that are tied to the planning and design of the educational program, and implementation activities are those that are tied to the implementation of your charter school and the educational program. So some activities are only allowable in the planning phase and some are only allowable in the implementation phase. And then there are a few that are allowable in both phases. One thing to note is that certain purchases that are allowable during the implementation phase may be purchased during the planning period. Those will still be budgeted as part of implementation costs. So the phase in which a purchase is allowable is determined by the type of activity and not necessarily when the purchase was made. So an example of this is if you're looking to purchase desks for your classrooms or smart boards for each classroom, these purchases are considered implementation activities, as it's tied to the implementation of the school and the educational program. But these purchases are, you need to make them before the first day of class. Kids need desks to sit in and smart boards to learn from. So it's an implementation activity that can be purchased during the planning phase. So just wanted to highlight that for y'all. As discussed, there are some activities that are allowable during both phases. But here's just a breakdown of some general activities that are allowable for planning, salaries for specific positions, contracted services, and rental or occupancy costs. During the implementation phase, that's when you can, our implementation activities include purchasing classroom equipment and furniture, equipment installation, textbooks, playground equipment, or a bus or a van to transport students. And then in both phases, activities like staff training, purchasing administrative furniture, or any sort of outreach, marketing, recruitment materials, those are allowable in both phases. So moving on to some allowable uses of funds. When we're filling out your application, we ask that you ensure that all costs associated with the CSP grant must meet the minimum threshold of the following 4 things. First, is this expense necessary? Is that item needed for the startup of the charter school? So just ask yourself, is what I'm proposing to purchase necessary to accomplish the goals established in my application? Next, is it reasonable? Would a reasonable person spend that amount of money on an item, and would it withstand public scrutiny? So if you are proposing to serve 5 students on your campus, but you're requesting $700,000 in administrative costs for those 5 students, that would not necessarily be a reasonable request. So please make sure that the outcomes in your application are justified by the amount you are requesting. Next, is it allocable? And that is the cost being incurred specifically for grant startup, and is the cost proportional to the benefit provided? And finally, and we'll go over some allowable uses of funds now, is this item allowable under the CSP grant program? Any purchases made that are not allowable for this for reimbursement through the CSP grant program will not be reimbursed, and you will be responsible for those costs. So some allowable planning activities. Again, these are related to the planning and design of the charter's educational program, so you can spend money on just that and get reimbursed for it. You can also procure professional development or training for your teachers and staff, as well as any sort of special education support or planning. And then additionally, salaries are allowable during the planning phase. The reimbursement is only given for specific positions only. So that is teachers, school leaders, and specialized instructional support personnel. What constitutes specialized instructional support personnel will be clarified in the program guidelines that are posted along with the grant opportunity on the TEA Grants Opportunities page. Please note additional conditions do apply when it comes to payroll costs. Salaries cannot be paid for activities related to ongoing operations. Payroll expenditures will only be reimbursed with CSP funds if the time is spent on activities that support the planning or program design of the charter campus. And finally, no payroll expenditures will be reimbursed beyond the 30th calendar day after the campus begins serving students. So please note, if you have personnel that are splitting their time between ongoing operational activities and planning activities, only the portion of time associated with conducting the planning activities is allowable as an additional operational cost. The charter school must maintain accurate time and effort records to document the amount of time each employee is working on tasks related to planning activities associated with your charter school campus. Moving forward, some more allowable planning activities. Contracted personnel may be paid from the grant start date up to 30 days after the campus begins serving students. And you can also reimburse rental or occupancy costs for your school facility up to 30 days after the campus begins serving students. Please note that these contracted personnel are only allowable during the planning phase and up to 30 days after. Contracted services are allowable in both the planning and implementation phase. So I just want to highlight the difference between the allowability of contracted personnel, which is planning only, and contracted services, which is planning and implementation. Some more allowable implementation activities. You can purchase startup equipment necessary to implement your charter school. So desks, chairs, computers, tablets, iPads, equipment related to technology, smart boards, physical education and art materials, playground equipment. These are all allowable expenses. Additionally, you can purchase non-consumable supplies and materials for startup activities. Non-consumable supplies and materials, we define that as those that can be reused, such as textbooks, library books, reading materials, and teaching materials. Consumable items, which are items that cannot be reused, such as one-time student use workbooks, pens, pencils, papers that students are writing on. These consumable materials, because they do not have more than one life, are not considered eligible for reimbursement through the CSP grant. Only non-consumable supplies and materials are eligible. Additionally, you can request reimbursement for installation costs associated with computers, data systems, networks, telephone systems, the smart boards. If you purchase smart boards, you can pay for the installation of those smart boards through the grant. Additionally, you can one-time startup costs associated with providing transportation to students. You can purchase a bus with some of your CSP funds should you receive that grant. Additionally, you can request reimbursement for costs associated with carrying out necessary renovations and minor facilities repairs. Please note these minor facilities repairs neither add permanent value to the property nor appreciably prolong its intended life. So this is some guidance we've received from USDE. Please note these types of budgeted expenditures may require the approval from the U.S. Department of Education. So some examples of these facilities repairs include repairing a leak in a roof, replacing a broken window, repairing a furnace or air conditioning unit. In summation, minor facilities repairs do not add value to the building, do not prolong its intended life, but rather keep it in efficient operating condition. Please note that while these minor facilities repairs are allowable, no construction, no cosmetic renovations are eligible for reimbursement through the CSP grant. So moving on to some final allowable costs for implementation activities. You can purchase financial management software and training. Please note that these software costs must be a one-time expense. All of the CSP grant deals with it only reimburses one-time expenses. So we don't reimburse recurring expenses. So in this software example, if there is, let's say, software XYZ is a $1,000 purchase for a lifetime license, you pay $1,000. That software is yours to use for the rest of the time you need it for. That's an allowable expense, as it is a one-time cost. Let's say software LMNOP costs $200 per year. It's a subscription service. Because that would be a recurring expense, that is not eligible for reimbursement through the CSP grant. Only one-time non-recurring expenses are eligible for reimbursement. So the CSP grant is allocated into planning and implementation costs. So please keep in mind the phase in which the expenditure activity is allowed when you're creating your budget. So I just want to take some time to plug a great new resource that we have released in the past year. When you're looking at the CSP grant opportunity on the TA grants opportunities page, once it's posted, we will provide a link to what is called the planning and implementation guidance. It is an incredibly detailed document that will help you determine if an allowable expense is considered a planning activity, an implementation activity, or both. So we ask that you please read over this document before you crafting your budget and reference it throughout. So to highlight once again, CSP grant supports the planning, program design, and initial implementation of public charter schools. We will only reimburse one-time costs, not recurring expenses. So I just want to talk about some common budget mistakes now that we see and have to address during negotiations. These common budget mistakes usually lead to a longer negotiation process, which means you get your NOGA later. So I just wanted to highlight these so that you're able to receive your NOGA as soon as possible, should you be awarded a Generation 30 charter and a Generation 30 CSP grant. So first is budgeting salaries for personnel other than teachers, leaders, or specialized instructional support staff. We've had some people request our budget out costs for clerical or janitorial staff at the campus, which are necessary for your school to run. However, they do not meet the criteria of being a teacher, school leader, or specialized instructional support staff. Therefore, we will not be able to reimburse it. Another pitfall in regards to personnel salaries is budgeting for the reimbursement of personnel in the implementation phase. As we discussed earlier, salaries will only be reimbursed for allowable personnel up to 30 days after the campus begins serving students. Next is we see applicants including costs for construction or cosmetic renovation. Please remember that minor facilities repairs are the only thing in the vein of construction that are allowable, but absolutely no construction or cosmetic renovations will be funded through the CSP grant. Third, we have applicants including expenditures related to charter management organization fees. That is not allowable. And finally, we see budgeting for expenditures related to ongoing accounting or bookkeeping services. So you can purchase accounting software to ensure you're meeting your complying with FAR. However, you cannot fund ongoing accounting or bookkeeping services. Again, one-time expenses only, not recurring costs. So I just want to touch on some unallowable costs before we move forward. You're not allowed to use CSP funds to request reimbursement for any of the following items: religious instructions, materials, or insignia. You cannot request reimbursement for any ongoing costs related to transportation for students. Again, you can purchase a bus with a one-time payment, but no ongoing costs such as gasoline for those vehicles. That would be a recurring expense, not allowable for reimbursement. Absolutely no construction will be reimbursed. No consumable, instructional, or other supplies and materials will receive reimbursement. Only non-consumable materials will receive reimbursement. Those are multi-use supplies and materials. Expenses for field trips will not be reimbursable by the CSP grant. And finally, no expenditure in which the charter cedes fiscal authority to the CMO organization will be allowable. So on the program guidelines, which will be posted with the TA on the TA grants opportunities page with this grant opportunity in the future, those program guidelines will have the complete list of allowable and unallowable costs. So please read over that. Here's an example of what it will look like. In this circle right here, you'll see Generation 30, CSP, something along those lines. But the program guidelines will be posted in the application and support information section, along with that planning and implementation guidance I discussed earlier. So somewhat above this box will be eligible applicants. Should you be awarded a Generation 30 charter, you'll see your name listed there as one of the eligible applicants for this Generation 30 CSP non-competitive grant. Once the opportunity is posted, you will fill out an abbreviated grant application. It's abbreviated because you've provided us narrative responses in your Generation 30 application. You will also fill out a corresponding budget workbook. So those two things will be completed on your end, submitted to us, and then from there, the negotiation process will begin. So just wanted to 2 minutes to focus in on the goal setting you will be doing in your Generation 30 application where the CSP questions are embedded. So in your CSP grant application, you'll be asked to set 3 to 5 programmatic SMART goals that will be achieved using CSP startup grant funds. All of these programmatic goals should be achievable by the beginning of year 3 of serving students on your campus and clearly support the board's student outcome goals. Each of these SMART goals will have corresponding progress measures that will be used to track each startup goal. So as a reminder, SMART, that acronym stands for specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and timely. So I just want to go over 2 examples that we generated to show you sort of like what a good example and what a bad example looks like. So here we have example number 1. If we had more time, I would ask you all to read over it, but I want to be conscious of that. So I'll just say all of these goals are considered SMART. We'll just look over this first one as an example. So it is specific in that it identifies the exact instructional strategies that will support the academic model. It is measurable in that you can keep track of what the percentage of teachers were trained. It is achievable, as all teachers can reasonably receive these trainings. It is relevant to the grant purpose, as teachers who are trained in these instructional strategies can more effectively teach students and hopefully boost their outcomes. And finally, it is timely, and that there is a target date that is set. By this date, this will occur. So all of these goals are SMART, and these progress measures will effectively measure whether or not that this was attained. So this is what a high quality narrative response looks like. All of these goals are aligned to the overall grant purpose and the proposed project, are necessary for project implementation, and are aligned to the academic model. Additionally, all the progress measures are aligned to the SMART goals and would effectively measure progress towards them. Moving on to example 2, you'll see that these goals are not measurable, and most do not support the academic model or overall purpose of the grant. Most of these progress measures would not effectively measure progress towards the goals that they correspond with, and it is unclear how some of these goals would support project implementation. So after you write each goal, go back and see if it meets the SMART acronym and ensure that the progress measures will allow you to completely track all aspects of that SMART goal. Thank y'all for your time. I'll move on to any sort of questions that came in while I was speaking. All right, I see in the Q&A. Okay, can you submit multiple CSP applications for multiple sites? I'm going to get confirmation on that, and I will get back to you if you'll just be able to drop your email in the chat. It was posted anonymously, but I will circle back with you once I'm able to get confirmation on that. Is there a single grant for both phases? Correct. You will receive one CSP grant. Within that one CSP grant is the planning and implementation phase. And I see per yes. So when it comes to furniture, that is considered an implementation activity. So it would be listed under your implementation cost or implementation budget, even though it would be purchased during the planning phase. That's correct. Can you clarify from the last meeting which minor facilities upgrades are allowable? I just want to, in terms of bringing the building up to codes such as fence, double vestibules, locked doors, elevators, building sprinklers. For some of these items, like upgrading a fence, some of these expenses would increase the value of the building on the property and therefore would fall outside the parameters of minor facilities repairs. So please remember that these minor facilities repairs, the expenses that will be reimbursed will not add any sort of value to the building, nor appreciably prolong its life. Rather, just keep it in efficient operating condition. And then, is marketing for staff recruitment allowed? What about student information management system fees? Hillary, thank you for your question. I will, if you could put your email in the chat, I will get back to you with confirmation on both of those items. And then, does a new charter have access to IMAT/EMAT money, or is that considered and included within the CSP grant? I am not familiar with those acronyms, but I will look into that. I will just be able to note that the only sort of funding that goes within the CSP grant is federal funding from the U.S. Department of Education. So that is the funds that will be reimbursing you. I don't know about IMAT or EMAT, but I will get back to you on that, TJ. And then, are textbooks purchased and access online reimbursable? Yes, textbooks do not need to be physical textbooks. You can purchase, an online textbook. It just must be a one-time cost. It can't be, you need to pay, say, $20 per student per month for access to this. That wouldn't be allowable. But if it was pay $20 or $200 for lifetime access to this textbook, that would be allowable. All right, I'm just getting y'all's emails logged down. Lisa, you're also interested in knowing multiple CSP grants. CSP grants could be submitted for subsequent new campuses that are listed on the application. Also, is there a time limit on these? Could you specify what you mean by these? The grants, there is a timeline. It's between the grant start date and the end date. So all funds unspent by the grant end date will then be deobligated back to us at TEA, and we will then be returning those to the U.S. Department of Education. And then I think I'm just missing one person's email. CSP timeline, is it for the next 5 years? So yes, as mentioned on the first slide, the grant started on October of 2020 and will expire on September 30th of 2025. We at TEA will be submitting a request for a new grant application. This will be another 5-year CSP grant. The way the grant works is we apply to the U.S. Department of Education, we receive the funding, and then we pass that on to you as subgrantees. So we will be applying for another grant application in 2025, and then that will give us a new round of funding to continue giving out these grants. I believe that is everything. Again, TJ, if you could just drop your email on the Q&A just so I can be able to get you a response to that question you put in. But I believe I got to everything else.
Yes, Nate, I think you're up to date. And once we get TJ's email, we can pass it over to you. Not a problem.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you all so much for your time, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.
Awesome. Thank you, Nate. So Sarah, I'm going to kick it back over to you just to review the criteria before we jump into David's presentation.
I'm actually going to push it over to John for this
I'll take it.
audience.
Even better.
Yes. No, I'll take it. And before David jumps on, I'll introduce him in a second, but let me share my screen and again ground us in some criteria in the application. So the finance section is a is a staple in our application process. And so just wanting to again frame this discussion as a reminder to revisit those criteria as you listen to David, as well as when you are drafting your responses. So going back to the criteria, focusing on the budget narrative, big picture, you want to just ensure that you're providing a very detailed, realistic, and viable budget. Again, as Sarah said, I'm not going to read all this to you. You can take a minute as I'm speaking. In terms of the budget narrative, also want to be sure, and David will most likely hit on this, that you're providing some sort of actionable contingency plan should you encounter any budgetary shortfalls. With regards to the workbook, you always want to be sure that the workbook is supported by the budget narrative. Again, Dave will probably reinforce that in a minute. And then in the workbook as well, that you're providing a viable budget that we can see over the course of 5 years, we'll be able to support those programs, including those students with disabilities, emergent bilingual students, gifted and talented, et cetera. And then a little bit more, you also want to ensure that in your financial planning that you're including clear policies and processes for how you're going to do accounting, purchasing, payroll, et cetera. You're going to want to be sure that you clearly differentiate the roles and responsibilities of the school's administration and governing board for those school finances. And then a big one is Charter First, as it is my PowerPoint went crazy for a second. Our Charter First, if you have questions about it, David's here. You can most likely answer some of those questions. But you will be will receive a Charter School First rating. So even in the planning right now, you can ensure that a lot of those policies and practices that you're putting together will meet the Charter First ratings. And then lastly, just in terms of your audit report, you want to ensure that you're demonstrating that your entity has liabilities that are going to be less than 80% of its assets. So again, just grounding this conversation in what our external reviewers will use to score and assess your application. Now, with that said, I'm going to kick it over to David Marks. And David has been with our process since before me. So that's at least, David, you can speak to that. Gen 18? When did you start reviewing these apps?
As soon as when the legislature changed over where TEA was taking the lead
All right.
on the applications is when I started. So since this process started for us.
And so I mentioned this, and again, going back to you all doing your homework and going back and looking at our archived capacity interviews, you will see not only my face, but you will see David's face every year. Again, since this process has become the commissioners. And so you will see David has a lot of similar questions every year, a lot of things that our applicants kind of historically trip over or don't really flesh out in their application. So he's a real benefit to us, and I hope you all have some questions for him that he can answer today. All right, David, let me pull your deck up.
While you're doing that, I think if they go and look at those older videos, they're going to be amazed at how you and I haven't aged at all.
Not at all. Not one bit.
Process.
Not one bit. Not one bit.
Yeah, I mean, the good news is over the years, my questions have they've evolved as the strength of the applications have gotten better. So I mean, I think that's definitely good news, because if you were to watch some of those early videos, you would see that there were a lot of blanks that were left in the budget narrative or in the workbook, and that always provides some questions from me and my team, because what we're trying to assess is, are you building a charter school that's going to be financially viable, and are you going to be able to support the students for the long term? And so that's really what our goal is looking at as we're analyzing your applications. So keep that in mind. We're not just looking for short term, but we're also looking for long term goals as well, and making sure that it's going to be a viable charter school from start date until well long into the future. All right, so the finance areas in the application. So we have 3 that are narrative. So the startup plan, financial plan, transportation. And then many of the other pieces of the application will in fact kind of touch on financial, even though they may not specifically have financial in them. So even if we talked about your curriculum needs and what you plan to do for curriculum, you may mention in curriculum that you're going to provide some reading comprehension software. As my team is looking through the application, we may not spend all of our time on the curriculum piece because we have curriculum people that are reviewing that. We will look for, though, that type of information and see if you included it in your budget narrative and then also in your financial plan workbook. So we touch on most of the topics, but the three big ones over there are the ones that we highlighted. And then in your attached documents, we will review every single one of those in detail. And we look at the narrative and that what you're saying in your budget narrative makes sense. You've incorporated, if we went back to that curriculum example, that you've included in the budget narrative the curriculum piece where you're going to buy the reading comprehension software. Same with the financial plan workbook. As you work through those tabs, that there's a bunch of formulas in there, and they kind of build on each other. And so we're making sure that one, you're documenting in your financial workbook, but also that we will do some math checks within the tabs themselves just to see if they are adding up and if they look correct. And then evidence of financial support. If you pledge that you're going to have $1 million in contributions, we will be looking for a letter that says we are going to give the charter school $1 million upon approval of the charter, or we've already given $1 million because we wholeheartedly believe in this plan and we think that this charter is going to be a great success. So if you mention any local funds and you need to have a letter of support, because that is probably one of the top things that we look for, and then it's also one of the top things that we will comment on. If you're a nonprofit and you've been around for a while, we will expect to see an audit report. And if it's a brand new nonprofit and you haven't been around, then of course you'll have to address it. And generally, you won't have an audit report. Same goes for the credit report. If you've brand new charter, you won't have a credit report for us to look at. And then the same with the IRS Form 990. That's your annual form that all nonprofits have to file. And you may or may not have one of those, but we will look for that. All right, so if we take the budget narrative, we asked for, and I'm just going to concentrate on the key points. You can read the blue side after this presentation is over. So for the key points, support the assumptions that you've made in the revenue and the expenses. So if we go back to the local contributions, if you say that you're going to have $1 million in contributions, then we would want to see some kind of support for that. From state funding and federal funding, if you're going to talk about those things, then we would expect for you to have some narrative talking about state funding. Obviously, the budget template is going to have a state funding template for you to complete that will help you project how much funding you're going to receive. But if you're going to use child nutrition or Title I funds, then we just ask that you are able to support that. Not necessarily a letter from the federal government, but with some costs that you've researched to determine how much an average student may receive. Would be one way of supporting the revenue side. And then the same with the expenses. If you've got expenditures and you've already signed a lease for your building, then we would want to know that you found a building, it's suitable, it's going to meet all of your needs, and in fact you've signed a lease and how much that's going to cost. Any financial plans that you have for the charter, which most of you will have, growth plans, what types of information can you use to support the financial plans? Generally, it's either by the number of students increase, therefore you're going to need this increase, or maybe there's a location that you found that's more suitable in year 3, so you're gonna move to that facility. Then we would want to know that type of information. The budget narrative also provides context to the workbook. We will cross-check between the workbook and the narrative. So if you list something in the budget narrative, but it's not in the workbook, chances are you're going to either hear from me or one of my staff, and we're going to question you why it made it into one versus the other. Sometimes it's oversight. Sometimes it's just you may have different people working on the budget narrative versus the workbook. But we're going to want to understand why it was in one spot but not in the other. So making sure after you get everything completely written, you go back and you make sure that the budget narrative, everything you wrote in your narrative, gets included in your workbook. All right, the financial plan workbook. My team and I spend quite a bit of time within the workbook itself. There's quite a few tabs, and so chances are we may ask you a question about your state funding template, especially if you talk about that you want to serve a higher population of special education students. We're gonna look in the budget workbook and see if you do in fact have that as one of your you've scored it and indicated in the workbook that you're going to serve a higher population of SPED students. If you say it in the narrative, we're going to look in the budget workbook to see that in fact that's the case. We also may follow up though with how did you come up with the estimates that you came up with. If we stick with the special education students, how did you come up with a higher population of special education students? So that may be a question that we would follow up with you and ask on how you came up with your assumption. And then once again, making sure that the assumptions in the workbook are matching your budget narrative. That middle one, explanations are provided for each of the assumptions made on the startup and assumptions tab. We will definitely look at that. We will look at it for startup year and for year 1 and going forward. And what's helpful is documenting either if it's, let's say, professional development for your teachers. That's not necessarily going to have a growth by student. That may have a growth by teacher increase. And so you'll want to think logically and critically about what is driving growth. And so some of those will be student growth. Some of them may be teacher growth. Facilities may not be student or personnel growth. It may be just square footage. And so as you're working on your assumptions, making sure that the assumptions you're making are in fact reasonable and logical, and that's what we're focusing on. If you leave assumptions blank, especially if there's going to be a high growth there, you probably will get a question from us about that as well. And then on the last box over there under the student populations, I kind of touched on, we will ask about each of the student groups identified, especially if you're in certain areas of the state where maybe we see more students comp ed, then we'll expect for you to incorporate the comp ed funding in there as well, or for emergent bilingual, or if you're serving younger kids, then we would expect for you to identify students as early education which is twofold. So it does bring in more revenue for you, but the revenue streams that those student populations bring in also come with certain requirements that you spend that amount of funding on those students. But good news is we don't dig into that part of it at this point in time. We'll wait for that until after you start your charter, and then we'll give you lots more information about making sure that the funding that those special student populations earn are spent on them. All right, so some other things to think about. So I've talked about the baseline assumptions a little bit on how you would come up with the assumptions. That middle one, paying debt, that is really, really, really important from my standpoint, because if you say that you're going to borrow $500,000, but then you don't give us a repayment plan, and you in your contingency plan say that you're going to save $10,000 every year, we're going to look at that and say your $500,000 loan payment isn't included in any of your expenditures, and your contingency plan is less than what your loan payment would be. For us, that creates a solvency issue. And so for us, we will be looking at, did you include in your budget the repayment of any loans that you said that you're going to have? If you have another company that will be loaning or gifting money to the charter, we will want information about how you're going to determine if it's a loan or a gift. And it is also how you're going to communicate with your board about if it's a loan or a gift. And if it's a loan, of course, we're going to want to see that repayment, and it's a gift, then we will hold that as an expectation, as long as you state in your application how long those gifts will continue. And as we're analyzing your charter and the solvency piece of it, we will take that in consideration. Scaling costs, that's similar to the baseline assumption. So there are other costs that may increase at a different rate. So just being mindful of how you come up with, as costs are increasing, what is driving that increase in cost. And then the final bullet over there about the positive operating budget. This one is essentially mostly gone away. So early on, charters would submit their budget plans and they would have negative operations. And so we would ask, well, what's your contingency? You're actually estimating that you're going to have a loss. What would you do if you experience that loss? So then they would have to tell us what that is. We still ask that question from time to time, just so that we're getting an understanding of not every charter ends up with 5,000 students to start their first year. And so budgets that's based on that, we want to know what will happen if you don't get 5,000 students in, and what the charter will need. So that's a question that we still will ask from time to time. But if you report a loss, you've guaranteed yourself at least one question from my team. And it's not, we want you to have reasonable and fair assumptions, but at the same time, we don't want you to build a budget that one, you're starting out with a loss, because other things can happen, and that's bad. But we also want your budget to be realistic. So if you are going to budget for a loss, then you better come prepared with a contingency and what types of areas that you can cut to reduce your budget in order to operate with a positive. And by the way, this is one of the first scores. So if as John mentioned, if you have questions about first, then I'm happy to answer those as well. But one of the first scores is that you are reporting at least your operations is neutral. So meaning that revenues exceed expenses. And we have a little bit of a calculation, but that's the general thought on that. All right. Short but sweet. We have any questions? Let's see. No questions. So we're gonna have, could be a quiet year for me then, on reviewing that.
We will see, yes. David, real quick, while people are thinking about any questions they might have, I did want to, you mentioned something I wanted to highlight as just a general best practice, something we've seen, I guess, with at least within the last couple of years. If you all in your application put that you're going to do something post submission, be sure that you still do it, because you might get an interview, and then that will be a question from David, like, hey, on page 15, you said that you, after submitting the application, will continue to apply for grants or apply for specific grants. It's not unforeseen that David will ask, like, hey, where are you on that? Like, what happened with that? Or again, broadening outside of finance. If you say, hey, we're going to have a particular staff member by May, we may ask you, like, hey, where are you on that? Especially if it's a key, position. So just want to reiterate to you all to ensure that before you submit the application, be sure that what you have included that you will do after submitting the application is still viable and something that you all will be able to maintain, should you get an interview and move forward in the process.
We have one question. But I was going to touch on, John, transportation. That's another one of those newer ones that people will talk about. They're going to offer transportation. And in fact, we have a transportation is part of the state funding template that they can go in and work. And so generally it's not as much of a question, but it's a comment from me or my team about, you say you're going to offer transportation, but here's some ways that you may get some funding. So, which would help. It's not going to offset 100% of your budget for transportation, but it will at least alleviate some of that expense for transportation if your transportation is going to be reimbursable.
So David, the question that we have is, it feels like a very specific question. If the person asking, excuse me, about starting their nonprofit, but for it to run the charter, but not getting the charter, so never having an audit. If you all could email the charter application inbox, so that's a very specific question to your application, to the extent that we can offer context to the attachment cover sheets, I think that'd be better addressed in an email. But great question.
And then as they're thinking of other questions, just recently, TASBO, so TASBO, I don't know how many people are familiar with them. It's generally school district focused, but they have now created a FIRST template. Some of the overachievers in the room, if they wanted to go and see how their budget compared with FIRST, they could go in and run that template. There's a Charter FIRST template on TASBO's website. It's open to everybody. And so they could go in there and see what those assumptions look like to see how they would score in FIRST.
David, could you speak a little bit to kind of the importance of like enrollment projections, whether they are, really high, really low, just kind of like the impact of that on the budget, just can you kind of touch on that a little bit?
Sure. So on your tab for enrollment projections, that is going to be your main driver of funding, that drives all of state revenue. And so we've seen in the past charters that have way over projected in enrollment, and it's made it difficult for some of those charters to operate. TEA has some baseline of what an expectation is that a charter, a minimum number of students that a charter would have. And so at a minimum, that's being checked by probably everybody that you see in the meeting right now, that we're meeting those minimum baselines. On the flip side, though, if you're gonna over project, and if we go back to that 5,000 example, um, most charters, unless you can show that the community output, which is something, John, maybe that you might have touched on. If not, then I probably need to build that into my side, because John and I both focus on community engagement and what types of activities are happening in the community, because that's largely a driver of enrollment and shows the agency what interest there is in the community. And so if you're going to build an enrollment with starting out with 5,000 kids, then we're going to want to really see a strong community engagement around that. And if your budget's built around 5,000 kids and you only get 1,000 kids, you've got to be able to plan for that and have some contingencies and how you're going to cut costs. So making it realistic, and really pay attention to the other charters in the area, looking at the student, the school district growth. I can tell you for all of the state, growth has slowed down since COVID. So no one is growing as fast as what they used to. And a slight plug, John, I think today the commissioner is at Senate Finance talking about enrollment. So they will archive that video. So if you wanted to see what Commissioner Morath is speaking to the Senate Finance about, you can go back and watch that archive video later, and that might help you determine what your enrollment would be.
Great. David, we have another question, but it's not finance related, and we don't have any other finance questions. So I will give you back some time. Thank you so much for attending. And you will hopefully see some of these folks in May for the capacity interviews. Yep. We did have a question, speaking of growth. Someone's asking for us to kind of summarize something we mentioned in the app info session about expansion. And Brittany, cut me off if I'm wrong, but in terms of expansion, so you will include your initial campuses in your application. And by initial campuses, I'm referring to the number of campuses that you plan to open in the first 5 years. As it relates to expansion, there are certain areas that you can ask for an expansion amendment. That would be number of campuses, that would be maximum enrollment. Those being the two big ones. If you have a 5-year contract, what we were saying in the app info session is that the earliest that you can apply to expand would be the end of your 3rd year of operation to be effective beginning of year 4, right? So meaning if you say, John, we want 500 students, but you knock it out the park in year 2, you're like, hey, I think we can do 700. You would not be eligible to apply for that until the end of year 3. And there are some requirement expectations associated with that approval of that expansion. So that's why we were saying in the app info session, you want to be very clear and confident about the projections you put, because you will be bound to those for at least the first 3 years of full 3 years of operation. And I hope that answered the question. That being said, I do not see any other questions. We'll give you all 30 seconds. Type your last minute questions in.
While we're waiting on that, Sarah, do you have anything else you want to notate? Same for you, Christy. Anything else that you want to point out?
Just a reminder that we do have our office hours coming up. You don't have to register for the link is already on the charter applicants page, so you'll just pop into that Zoom. If you have any questions, just being mindful that we are limited by how we can help you. I also just want to plug that we do have our next support seminar, number 2, on October 30th. The registration link is already posted on our applicants webpage, and that one let me just double check the time for you all so I can make sure I get it correct. That one will be taking place from 3:30 to 4:30. And in fact, all the remaining support seminars will also take place from 3:30 to 4:30. So again, we will go over special populations. So looking at SPED and emergent bilingual as well.
Thanks, Sarah. Okay, team, so I don't see anything else in the chat. Again, please feel free to follow up with us in our charter applications inbox. We can help you if you have some technical questions. Hopefully you got a lot of information about governance today, as well as CSP and our finance team, who are wonderful with great questions, great input on all the things that you're going to have to do in your application. Please feel free to reach out to us if there is something that comes up and you would like to get some feedback. Again, we will and try our best to answer what we can. So team, if you guys do not have anything else, we're going to go ahead and close out here for today. Before I do that, I'm going to give everybody one more second. Any more questions? Wonderful. All right, guys. Well, thank you again for